Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian Morgner, and as one of the conveners of the BSA Theory study group, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the life and work of Erving Goffman. This event is part of a series in which we invite speakers to revisit an influential sociological thinker and consider their relevance to contemporary issues and debates, such as racial inequality, social complexity, and radical social change. We challenge our guests to unsettle established narratives about the great theorist and to defamiliarize the classics. Through these discussions, we're aiming to generate insight into old theories and new debates, both in the discipline of sociology and society as a whole. I'm very pleased that Peter Lunt has kindly agreed to join us today for this discussion. Peter is professor in media and communication at the University of Leicester, and he is currently working on a book called Goffman and the Media, to be published by Polity Press. We will talk about this upcoming book in our discussion. But before we do so, I would also like to say a few words about Peter's academic background. He has degrees from the University College of London and a PhD from the University of Oxford. And before joining Leicester, he was working at Brunel and the UCL. He was a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, University of Illinois, University of Oslo, and many more, but also the University of Pennsylvania. And as some of you might know, this was for the last university in the career of Goffman before his death. And Peter just told me before this conversation that he was able to talk to some of the staff that had actually met Goffman, which also informed parts of his book. Peter has a long-standing interest in the work of Erving Goffman, which is reflected in his research on talks on television, public debates, everyday consumption experiences, and he has published numerous books and articles on the subjects, like his books on talk on television and mass consumption and personal identity. And as already mentioned, his upcoming book is on Goffman and the Media, and we will pick up on that in our discussion. For the discussion, we have decided that we would like to divide it, into three broad areas. In the first part, we want to focus a bit more on the person of Erving Goffman. So, starting, by discussing why Peter, had an interest in writing this book. And then in the second part, we will discuss his approach and contribution to sociological theory. And then in the final part, we will have a bit more time to talk about Peter's research and how he implemented, Goffman's thinking in his own research. After that time, so after about 45 minutes, we have some time for questions, and please feel free to use the chat function. And I would like to ask you to stay muted, during the discussion. And please also do note that this discussion, or that the entire session is being recorded. So if you turn on your video, or if you turn on your audio, that automatically means that you agree to be recorded. Okay, Peter, so I've just mentioned, you're working on a book called Goffman and the Media, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that book at the beginning, and let us know why you wanted to write this book in the first place.
Okay, well, this book's in a series called Theory and the Media, and in a sense, it speaks to one of the questions behind your series of discussions, because it basically, it's a group of well-established, mainly dead white men who've influenced media and communication, social theorists that have influenced media and communication. And there's Kittler and Habermas and so on in this series, and they're very interesting books. But on seeing the series, I just thought to add to that list, to add Goffman to that list would be very interesting. And partly the reason I did that was, yes, I've sort of used ideas from Goffman in my own work over the years, but also I just noticed that there was a fantastic rejuvenation of interest in Goffman's work, particularly in relation to developments in social media. And it's an intriguing history, the relationship between Goffman's work and research in media and communication, because in a sense, in the era of mass communication, when media studies was rather bifurcated between the study of mass communication and interpersonal communication, Goffman had a tremendous influence. This is in the 50s and 60s. had a tremendous Are you speaking, Christian? I can't hear you, Christian.
Okay, there you go. You're back now.
Okay, did I disappear?
Yeah, you disappeared for a second, but no worries.
Oh,
I think
okay.
you were just talking about the mass communication, and then you broke off.
Oh, okay, right. So Goffman's initial influence in the field of media and communication was during the era of mass communication, and at that time, research in media and communication was very much bifurcated, or between the study of mass communication and interpersonal communication. So Goffman's initial influence and the interest in his work was very much in the study of interpersonal communication, and he had a fantastic influence on that work, really stimulating new ideas in the study of interpersonal communication, and providing an interface, a collaboration between social psychological approaches to social interaction and communication, sociolinguistics, and microsociology. And so it was a powerful mix that is inherent in his work, I think, which really sort of stimulated really new thinking in interpersonal communication. And some key areas of work within interpersonal communication and social psychology and social linguistics were stimulated by his work. And this is characteristic of Goffman in a way, that his influence was to stimulate other academics. And it often took the form of them picking on specific concepts of his, and then taking them into their own discipline and doing what their own discipline does. So in an earlier life, I was a social psychologist, and many social psychological studies in the 60s and 70s were of this character. And that it creates a certain relation to his work, which is essentially that they think he's a great generator of ideas, but they don't worry too much about his broader sociological context of work and the sociological questions that he was asking. But they take these wonderful concepts. An example would be politeness, or when he's studying self-presentation, that is taken, and it's taken into the psychological laboratory or into the psychological, social psychological study, and gets transformed into a sort of more rigorous, systematic, in the view of these researchers, approach. So in interpersonal communication, you sort of rather had that influence. Yes, very exciting ideas that will be picked up. There's a wonderful example, which was Michael Argyle's work on interpersonal distance. And there's many examples in Goffman's work which suggests that we have strategies of compensation on different channels of communication in interpersonal communication. So if we're a bit too close, we'll look away. And he's got these wonderful descriptions of people being in lifts, not looking at each other in the eyes, and so on and so forth. And so Michael Argyle took this idea and started running experiments with people, putting them in rooms, making them go close to each other, and recording the results of this, and coming up with what he thought to be a sort of systematic approach to the study of interpersonal communication. And Goffman visited Oxford to give a talk. And Michael apparently asked him, why don't you do some proper research on the basis of, of your writing, like I do, and this sort of thing. And Goffman apparently imperiously said, well, I'm very happy that you're doing that, Michael. I think I'll leave that to you guys to do that. But it's sort of symptomatic of his reception within media and communication, that he's been understood as a kind of generator of concepts that are then operationalized by people in their research. And what I suppose, looking at contemporary media and communication and the study of social media in particular, there's been an amazing revival, because in a sense, this bifurcation between interpersonal communication and mass communication has been very much interrupted by the development of digital and social media. And so the two fields, in a sense, are beginning to come together again. Concepts and ideas that were, as it were, designated for the study of interpersonal communication, and now there as part of broader media and communication. And so people are picking up again on Goffman's work and trying to understand how people create impressions through social media, manage their social interactions through social media, and so on. So it was that revival and the changing notion and nature of the reception of Goffman's work within media and communication that intrigued me and sort of motivated me to do the book. And also I kind of had this feeling that this idea, this way of thinking about the influence of Goffman's work, that somehow he's just provided us with and it is a fantastic list of concepts that he's provided us with, self-presentation, impression management, framing, the sort of communication roles. The list goes on, and all of these concepts have been picked up in media and communication in different forms. But my sense was that that's not enough to understand Goffman's value to us and influence on our work, as it were, to say that we just pick up these concepts and run with them. So it's an opportunity for me to think through that question, writing the book. What is there that makes these concepts work for us, that's inherent in Goffman's broader work? So that's one of the things I'm trying to do.
So in a way, Peter, so as a follow-up question on this, I was wondering, this like social media meets Erving Goffman, if that meeting between the two is always like a happy marriage, because you've talked about the interpersonal communication, and there's something that derived from work in remote areas in the world, like the Shetland Islands, in lifts and so forth. So it's not so the places that we typically associate with social media and global communication and all of that. So what is the potential for the two really to come together, or is that something that is recognized, these very different origins in the way where communication derives from?
Well, not really. I mean, when I started really, reading into the literature to prepare those chapters of the book, where I look at the way his concepts have been used in media and communication, certain things became sort of very clear. So, firstly, that there is an inherent interpretation of Goffman's work that sits beneath the appropriation of these concepts in media and communication research. So you notice certain things. So firstly, that there's a bias towards certain aspects of his work or certain concepts that are picked up more than others, and all other areas of his work are just sort of not registered. And so in the early days of social media, and initial social media was used for very specific purposes. It's not the thing it's become now, but one of the things that it was used for was dating websites, basically, in early social media applications were dating websites. And dating websites are obviously, in a sense, a social context in which, first impressions matter and self-presentation becomes a sort of key feature. So you can see why we were drawn to those concepts, pulling those into media. And what's happened as social media itself has developed and become less of a sort of forum for sort of projecting the person into a sort of a space in that sense, and has become more and more something in which it's integrated with everyday life, and it's about the sort of engagement of our broader social relations. So the sociality component of this changes. In a sense, other aspects of Goffman's work then come into view. So, for example, there's been some recent interest in his work on face, and looking at social media contexts as a context in which the ways in which we project and support each other's social identities through face work is being played out online. I think that's kind of interesting. And what begins to happen is a sort of building up of a broader engagement with this work as time goes on in social media.
Yes. But then, Peter, you also mentioned that you feel that despite Goffman being picked up in these current debates, that it also seems that it is somewhat selective, or not potentially not really engaging with Goffman to the extent of how his work developed. So I wonder if we could also shift a bit our discussions to that project, right, to the project of Erving Goffman, and how also maybe this has come about, and how he got inspired to think about communication and interpersonalization and these aspects. So I wondered if you go back a bit in time and look at the beginnings of his career, and as he was quite influential early on, maybe you could describe a bit to us what was the kind of intellectual academic climate in which Goffman arrived in the United States when he came from
Sure.
and joined Chicago.
Sure. I mean, just before I pitch into that, I mean, I think it's another thing that's intriguing me about doing this work is that there's a fantastically developed secondary literature on Goffman. And there was a period, I mean, that's been the case throughout time since his early writings in the mid-50s. And there was and in doing this book, I've been reading the secondary literature as well as going back and rereading Goffman. And what's intriguing is that the literature that emerged after his early death in the early 1980s, that there was a proliferation of commentary and literature and very, very interesting work. And some major social theorists engaged with Goffman's work at that time. And what's intriguingly rereading that literature now is that you really get this sense of a history of the present. So that a particular view of Goffman's work kind of sort of concretized in the 1980s around these perspectives. And as I began to read them, Giddens would be a good example, and the way he incorporated aspects of Goffman's work and ethnomethodology in his structuration theory. And the story there is that here's this kind of fascinating ethnographer of everyday life, but he was basically absent of a social theory. So what we need to do is plug his work into a different social theoretical context. And then people like McIntyre in After Virtue has a whole chapter on Goffman's work. And there Goffman is presented as the interpreter of the cynical aspects of self-presentation and influencing others through our own conduct, a sort of cynical view of social interaction and social work. Those kinds of concepts, yes, he was an ethnographer, but not tied into broader social questions. And also that he basically gave us a sense of social being as basically a manipulative, as sort of cold, manipulative form of social being. Those kinds of images really stuck. And again, I'm going back and reading Goffman. I think this is a problematic way of it's one-sided view of Goffman's work. So, for example, it is true that he looks at various forms of manipulation. He's very interested in questions like the ways in which people can disguise their intentions from other people, create positive conceptions of themselves in other people's minds, and sort of even looking at things like confidence tricksters and spies who become sort of experts in these forms of manipulation. But my sense is that this is not that he wanted to say that this was a way of understanding the role of social interaction in social identity and social life, but that this possibility, this capability meant two things to him. Firstly, it meant the central importance of secrecy and control of information about ourselves in social life, that was a key aspect of our social life. But also it meant that it showed us something about the openness and the constitutive nature of social interaction, that we can, if we can, as it were, influence people in these ways through our own conduct, that shows in a sense what a powerful and open form of engagement and meaning making social interaction is. So it was kind of, so that's one point. And the other point is that this is a fascinating thing because in a sense, spies and con men and so on, these sorts of actors as well, of course, they're developing a sort of finessed version, an expert version of what we do in everyday life. And so that's another theme that runs through Goffman's life, that he's fascinated by the ways in which social traditions, social customs, and social institutions emerge from the practices of everyday life. So he's got a continuum, if you like, everyday life practices at a certain level of awareness of how we present ourselves. And then that can become expert in spies and con men. And then that's institutionalized in the process of acting. So then we begin to see that his concept, for example, of social life as performance hooks into these interesting questions about the relationship between institutional forms and forms in everyday life, forms of interaction in everyday life. So that's another thing that I'm interested in. So, okay, so.
And Peter, you mentioned now that the words of everyday life, and I wonder if I could pick up on that in a way, because like you said, so, there is a certain reading of Goffman as the kind of, micro-sociologist, and someone, so, who looks, at certain, moments of everyday life from the perspective of the ethnographer and that sort of, particular tradition. But then actually, so, when you look at his work, I mean, he's quite different because, when he talks about everyday life, and, just to use the example, like his PhD study on the Shetland Islands, it's not sort of, an ethnographic study in the traditional sense. I mean, we don't learn anything about, I don't know, the music, the sort of, Shetlanders' minds, their folklore, their traditions, anything you would find in a very sort of, typical ethnographic study. So all this is absent. And I mean, when you read sort of, his sort of, like updated version of his dissertation, you wouldn't even know that he had spent time sort of necessarily in the Shetland Islands. So
yeah.
So what is sort of, his understanding of the everyday, Peter? Isn't that already sort of, a very sort of, theorized or conceptual version? And
well, yeah, I think that's the implication of that. It's interesting. So I think to understand that, we need to understand his relation to Chicago school sociology. So this is in the early 1940s. He went to Chicago to do his PhD, and one of his supervisors, Clyde Warner, had done some fantastic urban ethnography studies, and that had been one of the traditions of sociological research, the first sort of phase of sociological research in Chicago. So ethnographic qualitative research tied to a very specific normative project, which was very much tied to the progressive movement in the early years of the 20th century. And also backed by pragmatism in philosophy, that we don't basically over-theorize, that we basically engage with the empirical and allow our sort of understanding to emerge from that engagement. So strong normative project, strong sort of empirical orientation, and a strong sort of foundation in pragmatism in philosophy. But by the time Goffman arrives in Chicago, these three sort of strong planks of Chicago sociology have all but dissipated. And Chicago is no longer the sort of dominant sociological school in American sociology at that time. And so you've got a young Erving Goffman coming along, and he's joined Chicago. And one of the things about Goffman is, in a sense, is that he didn't buy it, the death of the tradition. And there's something cursed about him. He sort of basically picks up the sense that we can take this tradition forward, albeit in a new idiom. So he's not a progressive in the traditional American sense. But he's picking up on themes in pragmatism, particularly Mead's distinctions between the I and the me, and his theory of interaction and its relation to identity and meaning. So he's very influenced by these ideas, but at the same time, he's very eclectic in his reading. So he's not really, he's both an insider and an outsider in the Chicago tradition. So for example, he's very influenced by his reading of Durkheim, particularly Durkheim's late work on the sociology of religion. And going back and rereading Simmel, which is, I think, very influential on his method, because, as you say, he goes therefore to the Shetland Islands, not an urban ethnography, so not in the Chicago's tradition quite, not part of the normative project of the Chicago's tradition. And the way I would describe it is that he's got all of these ideas of social theory, which are very disparate and one, some would argue, contradictory, but it doesn't seem to matter to Goffman. He's got a set of sort of deep conceptual resources, which he then goes to try to do a specific project. And it's a sociological project, and his project is to basically, following Simmel, to try and understand the forms of social interaction as theatre or as performance. So it's not an open-ended ethnographic study. It's not an attempt to understand the social and cultural context of the Shetland Islands. It's a sociological project of a particular kind. And of course, he produces this fantastic, rich account of that in the presentation of Self in Everyday Life.
And Peter, you already mentioned sort of, he arrived in Chicago. So, and on the one hand, sort of, we had this sort of, tradition in a way that was sort of, had lost sort of, its appeal. because, I mean, the other sort of, program you hadn't mentioned yet that was, at that time very influential in the US was, Tucker Parsons. There was quite sort of, like a dominance of, post-war, reconstruction of, grand theory. And I kind of sort of, wondered, I mean, Goffman sort of, from what you've been describing, seems somehow also, a bit sort of, sit in between, right? He's not sort of, copying Tucker Parsons in building towards like a grand theory and, merging Durkheim with Simmel and all of that. But, likewise, he's also not continuing the Chicago school in that sense, right? So
yes, that's right. But I'm not interpreting as sitting in between those two traditions. I think he's trying to find a new idiom for the Chicago tradition, but he's conscious that by this time, Parsons and structural functionalism has become, has taken the place of Chicago in one sense in American sociology, and with a very different normative project, as you say, as a part of post-war social reconstruction, and an idea that you can bring social order to complex pluralistic societies by a combination of establishing agreed norms and values, and doing that under the auspices of authority. So Goffman is, I would say, I'm reading all of Goffman's work as, look, Goffman doesn't do theory. So he doesn't do a theoretical engagement with Parsons, even though Parsons is a theoretical sociologist. But what he does is instead, he writes against the grain of Parsons. He's always writing against the grain of Parsons in most of his work. And he has this strong belief that Parsons, as a theoretical sociologist, makes assumptions about the nature of everyday life, about the nature of social interaction. And what he seeks to demonstrate through his detailed, ethnographically oriented, observational observations and interpretations of everyday social interaction is to bring Parsons to account in various sorts of ways. So he does this in rather spectacular ways. He does it in very interesting ways. So that perhaps the best example is in his work in Asylums, where he's basically confronting, and he's confronting the traditions of social deviance, particularly as these are interpreted in Parsons' analysis, for example, of the sick role, where basically sickness is regarded as a form of social deviance that can be brought back into social order under the auspices of authority, of medical authority, and that we as individuals, as it were, if we are sick, volunteer for the position of the sick role. So we get voluntarism because we accept the conventions and the norms around the sick role, and it's sanctioned or legitimated by authority. Now, I think this is complete anathema to a sociologist like Goffman, and he starts to sort of demonstrate to us in Asylums, but and also in his book that he followed that up with in Stigma, and he demonstrates by going and doing an ethnography and sitting in an asylum in 1950s America, and he basically begins to unpick this whole idea of voluntarism. People are not there voluntarily. They don't accept the authority of the medical authority. And he begins to open up this question of the relationship between medical expertise and its legitimation and social control. And he basically begins to sort of construct the notion of social exclusion, that we can begin to understand this as a phenomenon of social exclusion rather than one of deviance. And so that's a contribution. And what's intriguing is that as he's doing this, he's surrounded by many other people who are rethinking these questions as well. You know, in culture, we've got One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you've got the anti-psychiatry movement going on. And this is typical of Goffman too. He couldn't be said to be leading the thought leader in this area. He's not rethinking the sort of sociological theory. He's not rethinking the social and cultural analysis. What he's doing is this extraordinary demonstration of a way of bringing to account and challenging this, what he saw now as the dominant theory. So his relation to these processes is interesting. He's got clear high levels of sort of sensibility to understand that there's this movement happening, and he becomes part of it. He's not in a sense joined to anti-psychiatry or anything like that. He's just picking up those sorts of themes and changes, and he's basically sort of seeing himself as reacting to what he sees to be the dominant sociological theory of the time. So I think that's characteristic of his work as well. The problem that causes, I mean, in a sense, you know, I started our discussion by saying, look, one of the problems is that people think he's a person whose work is full of fascinating concepts, but they don't get to the sort of theoretical context of his work and the sociological questions that he's asking. And in a sense, you can see he's his own worst enemy in this respect. Is in a sense, through the way he's done his work, through the way he writes about his work, he's never done that explicit engagement. He doesn't justify his work in terms of the specific theoretical questions or sociological questions that he's addressing. And yet his work, I'm claiming, is highly motivated by these questions in social theory. And he really thinks that he's providing something, a way of bringing social theory to account, would be a way of thinking about it.
So you know, Peter, if you know, when you kind of, you know, present that argument in such a way, would it then sort of, you know, be too far off to suggest that, you know, Goffman was maybe some sort of, you know, visionary for like in an early version of grounded theory? I mean, you know, Anselm Strauss was sort of, you know, one of his supervisors. So is that the kind of, you know, project that we are seeing here in a way? So if, you know, you go against the grain, right? You know, you build up your project from the data, right? But then it's not just like, you know, we heard it's not an empirical description in the sense of, you know, traditions and folklore, but there is a sort of, you know, analytical level, there is a certain, you know, theoretical element in it, you know, that's reflected in concepts like role distance and self-presentation and co-presence. So is it potentially sort of, you know, to argue sort of, you know, that we see here like another version of, you know, although it's not labeled as kind of like grounded theory, which sort of, you know, is something that developed only later on, but isn't that something that could also be seen broadly within such a tradition?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm sure Goffman, again, you know, he certainly helps. I haven't read and thought about the specific relations between Goffman's work and grounded theory, although I know the grounded theory literature as well. But I think this is, but in a sense, yes, but in a sense, no, because I think this is another example of a strand of his thinking being taken up by people and then turned into a sort of unified systematic approach. Goffman never wants his work to be that unified. Yes. It's the openness. He wants to be in touch with that broad range of questions that he started with. That's what motivates him. Yeah. And he really thinks of the social organization of everyday life as incorporating many different dimensions. Mm-hmm. Its ordering is not simple. On the one hand, he talks often of a set of conventions. He almost sounds Parsonian at certain moments, where he talks about an Anglo-American culture with certain values that are inscribed and can be understood as enacted through social interactions. On the other hand, his influence from Durkheim, particularly the sociology of religion, he's highly in the mode there of a ritual constitution of everyday life. So a rich set of concepts that really understand, particularly his work on face work, is very informed by that sort of notion. And he sees some aspect interaction as partly informed by those sorts of concepts. Here we are, and for him, that's a deeply almost humanistic concept. He sees in the ritual aspects of social interaction the way we come to value ourselves and others, and it's almost like, you know, the sacred is attributed to individuals through our politeness. I mean, I can only begin to say, if you look at the way politeness theory went, which is fascinating and working within sociolinguistics, but that's what I mean about it being both a sort of systematization but a reduction. Those sorts of elements of the arguments that come from Durkheim into his work are kind of stripped away when you start looking at it in terms of systematic forms of politeness, as it were. So yeah. Go on.
So Peter, so if you know, you mentioned, I mean, I find this really intriguing when you say that he, like, you mentioned, against the grain, the kind of, resistance against, great systems and bringing things together, and you stress, the openness of his work. But then on the other hand, I mean, you also sort of, show, like, with examples around politeness, or, when we think about the development of, his conception of, the speaker and listener, and then how it moved on to, the theater and the ritual, and then later the frame analysis. Yeah, although sort of, it seemed against the grain and he was reacting and open, on the other hand, we don't have the impression it's going everywhere and anywhere, right? And it's completely open. I mean, it seems sort of, there is a trajectory, there is sort of like a thin red line in there, and there are certain connections. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how you, despite the openness, how you still managed to, he still managed to hold it all together and sort of, progress in a way that seems now to us from the outside as something very logically and builds sort of in a very organic fashion on each other.
Well, obviously I've been reading too much Goffman, so I'm not. And I don't think he'd like this this line of questioning very much. I think, he always liked to keep his options open, and he was always ready to read the next thing and to see the next sort of emergent themes and ideas that were whether it was in sociology, in philosophy, or in literature, or sort of cultural analysis, and to bring those into his work. So that, I mean, openness in that sense. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. In a sense, he's you never get an articulation of a theoretical framework, perhaps with the exception of frame analysis, which in some ways is you can have different attitudes toward frame analysis, but it's a terrible book in lots of ways. It needed a good edit. It's not very clear, and it's difficult. It's difficult to read and to understand what his position is. But broadly speaking, the way I'm thinking about it at the moment, and I'm still working on this and writing about it, is that you can see his work as essentially in sort of two periods, and in those periods he had a kind of relatively coherent project, which then went into it, was transposed, and the up until I've talked a bit, and we've been talking about the sort of early work on social interaction. That's a fairly coherent body of work. And he did try to summarize it in books like Behavior in Public Places, where he tried to draw together. But even those books like Behavior in Public Places and Relations in Public, they're not very coherent books. They're really collections of essays. So he never quite gets to that point of sort of giving us a sort of framework for his social interactionist theory of social interaction and its relation to the social. But it's there. In his work, we can see a sort of fairly coherent set of ideas. And it gives us a picture of what are the key constituents of social interaction, and what the key sociological consequences or sociological implications of the way in which social interaction is ordered. What roles does it play? And you begin to get an idea that he understands there's to be certain fundamental forms of social interaction. So those can be seen, if you like, in his work on performance. So performance is a kind of form of social interaction. There are contexts in which most contexts have a performance dimension to them, and performance is a way in which I enter myself into the social world, and which I with others, because he's very keen on that idea of some sort of constituted interaction. So people form themselves and their identities through interactions with other people. And how that links, as I said earlier, to this notion that this is inherent in the way that social organizations work. So social organizations are both, as it were, generated from, there's a kind of social evolution of social institutions that come from these forms of organization in everyday life. But also social organizations have to be enacted. This was his point in Asylums, where even in a sort of highly controlled social environment, he gives these examples of the strategies for self-presentation and performance of the inmates within the asylum. You cannot give an account of, and this is why he's been so influential in organizational theory, that early work, because it gives us an account as it were, the interactional basis of social order. So that's relatively coherent, and it has its incoherences and it has its divergences, but you can pick that, you can point that picture. And of course, his work was fantastically successful. He wrote a number of bestsellers. They're still in print: Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Asylum, Stigma. They were all fantastic bestsellers. He was a pretty cool dude at this point, right? He's opened up an area of sociological research which has not, had too much prominence to that point. He's on the boundaries and of interesting social movements around social deviance and contesting those sorts of concepts. And his work is widely diffused and being read all over the place. But as the 60s go on, this sort of turns in a variety of ways. Firstly, where I started with this idea that he's getting a lot of citations, but a lot of the citations, if you go and look at them, are of the character that I talked about before. They're operationalizations. They say, oh, thank you, Goffman, that's a very interesting idea. I'll now go and develop a theory on the basis of that. So I think he was quite frustrated with that, as it were. He's never done the work to build a school around himself, as it were. So it's the work becomes very disparate in terms of its citations. But also what happens then in the 60s is that this area, which he's one of the dominant people in the sociological study of everyday life, suddenly becomes a province in which other key players start to emerge. So in 66, Berger and Lunt, The Social Construction of Reality. And in 67, Garfinkel's book, his early book on proto-ethnomethodology. Suddenly there were sort of exciting new, much more theoretically sophisticated accounts of everyday life that emerged. And Goffman last night I went and checked in the Social Construction of Reality, and there are a few begrudging references to Goffman, and they're quite belittling, actually. It tells you something about Berger and Lunt, but in a sense, suddenly his position started to change. And then also he was being roundly critiqued by the emerging critical sociology of its day. There was the famous chapter in Goldner's book, which also criticizes ethnomethodology. And Goffman begins to be seen, in a sense, how the 1980s theories began to picked up and saw him as being in this fantastic, informed, rich ethnographic account, essentially of the culture of middle class and post-war America. Mm-hmm. And so that he had the limitations of his scope, all of this pretensions that Goffman had, although he didn't articulate them theoretically, that he was kind of bringing sociology to account, that he was bringing ideas from different subjects into sociology. Suddenly that sort of starts to fall away. His project is diminished at that point. Yes. And it's from there that there's a real shift in his work. And you can see this, you can see it in Relations in Public. It begins to emerge where he starts to sort of think about ethnomethodology and to develop his answer to that, if you like, his engagement with it. Now, the ethnomethodologists were fiercely personally critical of Goffman. Some of the papers that they wrote, they're embarrassing now when you look at them. It's like killing the father. It's an extraordinary thing. So then frame analysis. He does something very interesting, because Berger and Lunt and Garfinkel, to a large extent, get their concept of everyday life from Schutz's phenomenology of the life world. And so what he does is he basically begins to try and rewrite a Schutzian version of his own theories, and frame analysis can be understood in that way. And he gives us a new interpretation. The first chapter of frame analysis is about the only piece of theoretical writing he does, but it isn't really theoretical writing. It's a kind of smorgasbord of concepts that he's trying to play with. But Schutz is at the center of it. And he then tries to sort of, in the rest of his career, be more explicit about that sort of phenomenological basis of his work. That's one thesis of it. And the theory of frames enabled him to start to be understood as having an articulation with more social processes. So his work gets picked up in different ways from that point. So an example would be his work on gender advertisements, which is, the foreword is written by a feminist writer, and his work is suddenly attached to the debates in second wave feminism as being, and for whom Goffman had opened up the idea that power and forms of social relations are constituted through the interactions between men and women, a very powerful idea when joined into feminist theory. So this is, so in a sense, I'm seeing his second phase of his work as a response to these criticisms that came, and as an attempt to rework his work in relation to these, to these new ideas.
Are there any questions from the audience? You can use the chat function, or also please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, but please do, and do be aware of recording this session.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
I tried typing it into the chat. When I used to worry about these things, I remember reading his presidential address to the ASA.
Yeah.
I think it was called on the interaction order.
Yeah.
And the point that one used to make to students was about this issue of how that order connects to something called social order, which had been the kind of traditional object of grand theory. And his answer in a phrase was that it was loosely coupled.
Yeah.
Do you remember that phrase?
Yeah, yeah.
And I used to think that was absolutely wonderful, because it was a sort of refusal of any attempt to sort of
yes.
make a sort of systematic and substantial bridge between the two.
Right.
And I used to think to myself, I never really put this to the students, that he didn't do that because it was impossible. And that this showed a very great understanding of his own project, which was, if you like, both ambitious and modest. It was ambitious for what it was interested in, which is the interaction order, right?
Yeah.
But modest in that he was not trying to produce an alternative to grand theories.
Right.
So the interaction order is not a theory of social order in the sort of grand theory sense of the understanding of that. He was not trying to do the stupid things that Giddens and Parsons were trying to do. I mean, of course, I'm sorry, I'm saying that provocatively, but he wanted to get right the very specific, neglected realm of human social life, which I think was initially identified by Simmel. I see Goffman as sort of Simmel's American pragmatist successor. And a bit like Simmel, Goffman was a gambler, wasn't he? I mean, he was a great maker of money out of in Las Vegas and all the rest of it. I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Well, let me.
Anyway, I'm going to stop there. You say what you think about the interaction order.
Let me respond to that, because I think I'm not sure he's as modest as you think he is. I think he thought that this he was open. Absolutely, he was opening up a space. It's the interaction order sui generis. He believes, he believes in its own tone. It can't be reduced either upwards to sociological explanation or downwards to psychological explanation. He says at one point that it's an entity in its own right. But even if you go back to his first book, in the conclusions of his first book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he sort of says this modesty thing. Oh, look, I've only been looking at a perspective on social life, and it's just showing you that this performance is one way in which people kind of express and realize themselves in social interaction. And then suddenly he says, well, and then there are different ways of thinking about order, aren't there? And he doesn't do this in any kind of coherent, theoretical way, but it's a form of, I would say, of juxtaposition. So, but he says something interesting. So then he says, oh, and then he has some strange labels for other theories of social order, which like the political and the cultural and so on and so forth. But then he says something very interesting, because he wants the interaction order to have a special status. It has a special status in relation to some of the things I've been talking about, particularly in this idea, the humanistic ideas of what it means to be a social being. So he thinks it's very special for that reason. And he's saying if you don't if you don't look at this, if you don't take notice of it, you are ignoring those aspects of social life. But he also says this form, the interaction order, he doesn't call it that yet, but the interaction order, as he would later call it, that interacts with all the other orders.
Yes.
They cannot live without it, as it were. They are inherent. It's kind of like a mediating social order from other forms of social order. Now that's beginning to sound like a theoretical framework, but Goffman never quite takes us there. But it's definitely motivating his work. And my point, that point I made at the beginning, that we're not interested in Goffman just because he's got these wonderful concepts. I think it's because of these questions that you've raised and that I'm talking about, that is the inherent values in Goffman's work, that he tries to make us think about the place of a sort of understanding of social being from the point of view of interaction order and its relation to other forms of order in social life. And that's a very important and big question. So in that sense, he's not modest at all. He thinks this is that important that it's...
No, I'd agree with that, yes, absolutely.
So we've got a few more questions from other members of the audience. Would it be okay if we continue sort of, with those? So we have a question from Dr. Davies, asking Peter, Professor Lunt, what is your reading of Stuart Hall's Politics of Signification and Goffman's frame analysis? Are they similar or dissimilar?
Well, this is a really great question. I can't answer that question, but I've often thought, and when I read Stuart Hall's work, it is quite clear to me that he's engaged with interactionism generally, and it's an aspect of his work that's not really been noticed. It's even there in what's his famous essay, Encoding Decoding. There's a section in there which is clearly about an engagement with interactionism, and I think that it's something I've not thought enough about, but I think I agree with the sentiment that there's some interesting engagement there. I think also there's elements of the way that Hall develops his theory of ideology that are sort of an interesting fit to the notions in frame analysis about forms of non-European conceptions of ideology. And so there are a myriad of connections that you can begin to draw. And I think Hall was looking for that kind of integration, cultural and social theory, and Goffman was, and frame analysis and social interaction was one way he could begin to think about those things. But I haven't thought about this enough, but I think, yes, it would be something to think further about.
Okay, Peter, and we've got like another question from Taylor Price. So he's asking a question about the relationship between Goffman and Bloomer. And he says sort of, I feel like they have important parallels, and that Goffman reads a bit like a reluctant symbolic interactionist. Neither sides each other, as far as he knows. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about the understandings of each other's works, or what is their kind of relationship with each other.
Well, there's a yeah. I mean, I think Bloomer's work is very important, and that's the attempt to reform Chicago that's happening when Goffman arrives as a PhD student, and there's a lot of interesting parallels between his work and symbolic interactionism. That essentially we constitute ourselves through processes of meaning. That they're a social constructivist process, and so on and so forth. So there's a range of clear parallels where Goffman would sign up to the basic presuppositions of symbolic interactionism. No problem, and it runs through his work. But on the other hand, it doesn't really fit with some of these other things that I've been saying about Goffman. So Goffman is this multidimensional thinker and a character. He's got lots of different commitments. And so whilst he would be happy to sign up for there, they must have been infuriated with him because of the way, the importance, for example, he gave to Durkheim's work, which was anathema to the symbolic interactionists. And partly it was anathema because it was so central to Parsons' theorization. So what Goffman is trying to offer us when he's doing this against the grain stuff, and he's using concepts from Durkheim to understand ritual in everyday life, he's trying to offer us an alternative interpretation of Durkheim's work. And he doesn't do it as a theoretical project, as I've said. He does it in this sort of way. So yes, so there's more to say about that. But basically, yes, he would sign up to the basic presuppositions of symbolic interactionism, and does, evidently in his work. But there are all these other things going on in his work at the same time, which don't really fit with that tradition. He's going back to the early Chicago school and Simmel, and that's clearly influencing him. His notion that he's going to go and discover the sort of key forms in which performance is articulated in social interaction, that's a Simmelian notion. And so he's got that going. It's not clear what the relationship between that and symbolic interaction is, although there's a wonderful book by Paul Rock, The Making of Symbolic Interaction, that sort of looks at the way these concepts are in the background of the formation of symbolic interactionism. So yes, so he's like a friend, but not a member of the club.
Yes. Peter, we've got one more question from one of the other co-conveners of the group, and it's a bit of a question that we had also briefly touched upon in our discussions of his when he references gender and other terms. So the question is, like Simmel, Goffman was ahead of his time, offering insight into postmodern digital society, but he was also a product of his time. So like the examples, as we also discussed in his use on gender relations, when he refers to mental health, but also there are like numerous references to other cultures in his books, etc. So how do you negotiate this tension between his forward thinking and his sometimes maybe backwards seems turns backwards in his turns in your book and progress, these two dimensions, how are they negotiated?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating problem, and having gone back and reread his work now, it's very conscious of it, as we've all become much more conscious of it. But it's very explicit. There's lots of examples of openly sexist and racist comments that are in his book. But this can't be avoided. It's a feature of his writing. I suppose. I mean, that's a general phenomenon that many people could have views about. What I would say in Goffman is that within his work, it stands. I've talked about the sort of humanistic dimensions of his work, and I've talked about, for example, the value that his work had for second wave feminism, and how he exposed various asylums as an absolute exposure of the sort of the travesties of organizational structure on the human spirit and on potential for identity. So he's an interesting character, because whilst he had these everyday sensibilities that were not worked out in the way we would now want him into, in many other ways he was, as we've been saying, he was progressive. He wasn't progressive in the sense of the early Chicago school, but he was clearly trying to sort of open up. And he was very committed to the idea of social life as a free exchange of free individuals, in a sense. So he's a contradictory figure in these senses.
Okay, Peter, I can't see any other questions in the chat, and also when I'm looking at my watch, it's now a bit past 2. So Peter, I would like to thank you for your time and for your interesting discussion and sharing your thoughts on Erving Goffman. I hope the participants in the forum also enjoyed our discussion, and I would like also to mention that there will be a range of other talks coming up in the near future. So there will be another conversation in a similar style that we're going to have in January. On the work of Norbert Elias. So this is also going to be with a colleague actually from the University of Leicester, Michael Dunning. So as some of you might know, Elias, he also worked here in Leicester for a certain period. So in case you're interested, I will welcome you to join. There is a link for you to sign up. Otherwise, if you within the academic sector, I hope you all have a lovely break during the Christmas period. I hope we'll have a happy Christmas, and if you know, can enjoy that time with your family. And then I hope I might see some of you again in January, and there will be other talks that, you know, are currently being planned in the pipeline in, you know, February and March, so I will announce them soon. But yeah, Peter, thanks again so much. It was a real pleasure having you here for this discussion. Thank you.